Thanks very much, Harriet. Going now to Rushanara, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I've got a couple of follow-up questions, and then I'm going to go on to consumer responsibility and then complaints and compensation. So just picking up on the Chair's question about, as a brief point, about Megan Butler's appointment. Nicola, can you just tell us whether you and the Chair considered an interim appointment and an open, so that you could do an open competitive process for the recruitment in order to assure everybody that you recognise the sensitivity of an appointment such as that one, and that actually it would have been good for confidence about how selections happen. You will appreciate that after the GRG scandal, certain people within the bank, that bank, remained within the bank, and that generated a lot of criticism. And so there is a wider concern, nothing, it's not personal to an individual, but there is a culture issue about how people are, how people would respond when they see that actually, despite a major inquiry, and despite the failings, that nothing really, things don't change in terms of individuals who bear some considerable responsibility.
Yeah, I understand the question, and yeah, I'm happy to expand on the thinking we went through, and also this was the subject, as Charles said, of discussion with him and the board. Absolutely. So I think in any transformation exercise, what's really important, and I felt this very acutely coming in from outside the organisation. Bear in mind, I was coming in working remotely as well, so I hardly met physically any of my new colleagues. So this was in October. It's very important to drive cultural change that you're able to bring your colleagues with you, that you're able to have advocates who are driving transformation across the organisation, who can carry the organisation with you. Whether we'd have secured the candidates if we'd gone for an interim role, I'm sceptical. And secondly, would it have had that wider cultural impact? I'm also sceptical, in all honesty. But what I did know I was doing, transformation is a team effort. So of course, Megan's playing an important role, but it's something that is going to be in the objectives of every single executive director, every single director across the Financial Conduct Authority, and everyone's going to be held account for their contribution. And I knew that in parallel, we were bringing in, likely to be bringing in significantly additional external
question of whether you did or not. I mean, I heard you before, and I think pretty convincing answer to the wider points. But did you consider the one, an interim appointment? If you didn't, that's fine.
I mean, all of those, I considered a range of options. But then if I'd gone for an interim appointment there, then what would I have done with supervision? What would I have done with all the other appointments as well? And how many interims? So there's been a knock-on consequence right through the executive committee.
Quite unique, quite different because of the Butler report. Sorry, because of the report that came out and related to the LCFs. That's why I asked the question.
No, absolutely, but I think there was a subcommittee of the board that was evaluating the issues of executive performance before I arrived. Actually, on LCF, it was something that had been constituted before. They took the judgment they did around the executives, as Charles has explained earlier. So I had, broadly speaking, the executive team that was there when I arrived, and I had to make sure that the responsibilities were allocated in the right way so I could get on with transformation, but also get on with building a new team. And one thing I would say about Megan as well, just as a CEO, you've got to try and look at performance in the round, recognising the very significant issues in LCF, and I absolutely do. But I also can see the fact that the wholesale financial markets in the United Kingdom stood up operationally resilient at a moment of record volatility and high activity at the start of the pandemic was down to several years of hard work and supervisory leadership. That had a big impact on the economy of the United Kingdom because it enabled companies to raise capital and get us through. Likewise, the smoothness of the preparation for Brexit. So you have to try to look at performance in the round.
Okay, well, I'll move on, but there are some wider issues not related to an individual, but about culture of institutions when things go wrong and how consumers receive a signal about whether anyone is accountable. But let's move on. You talked a fair bit about legal risk, culture change, and staffing, and I think a lot of what you've said makes sense, not least because many of us have found it very frustrating, as seeing how responses are often associated with having to clear things up, as Charles was saying earlier. Do you think that the FCA needs more resource and more support so that the ambition that you've got in terms of turning it into a much more proactive, more modernized institution to deal with the challenges that regulators face, especially in the face of technological challenges and risks? Do you think the FCA has got enough resource? Should it be given more support given the amount that you've got to do?
What I'd say on that question, and we covered this at my pre-commencement hearings, and my mindset going in, and maybe this is my genesis as a Treasury official, was not want to spend lots more money. I wanted to make sure that we were using the resources we have got as efficiently and effectively as possible, and I'm very focused on that right now, because I do think we can reallocate resources, we can do things differently and do things more efficiently to achieve our objectives. Saying that, I know the Treasury Committee in the past, and indeed the Treasury itself, has encouraged us not to go for more resources. I mean, that's been on the record from this committee. Saying that, if I do think, and I think I may be heading in that direction, but I think there may be areas where we do need more resources, I'll be open in saying so and having a conversation with all stakeholders about it. What I am conscious of is the overall resource demand on the system, combined FCA, FSCS, FOS and everything else, where we want to keep that as manageable as possible. Although I do sense the industry in particular is quite anxious on some of these economic crime points to see investments to reduce the cost that they're having to deal with from the consequences of some of this crime.
Okay, thank you. Charles, I'm going to move on to consumer responsibility, and a question for you. In her report, Dame Elizabeth noted that the FCA's failures of regulation are not excused or mitigated by the risk associated with LCF products. Do you agree with that conclusion?
Well, I certainly think that we need to be as good as we can be. I think that we made mistakes in the LCF case, and I think it would be inappropriate for me to engage in what might be called victim shaming by saying that people who bought LCF mini bonds should have paid heed to the warnings that they were given, which included warnings that they weren't covered by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme and that they weren't products that we regulated. The fact of the matter is that in the world in which we operate, we see consumers taking decisions that are not always calm and rational and well-informed. Some of them are very vulnerable when they take those decisions. Some of them are taking them on their iPhones. Yep. And they're not getting the sort of interaction with advisors that, to some extent, the system had previously perhaps assumed that would be part of any serious decision about money. And so we have to deal with the reality of the world that we live in. We have to try and do the best we can within a system in which consumer behaviour is what it is. At the same time, we need to see what can be done to enable consumers to take better decisions. And I don't think that the decision-making pathways that firms have to go through to comply with our rules are always pathways that really give consumers good information that they can act on. So we just need to be better at that, and we have to assume that the long-term task of consumer education and changing consumer behaviour is a very long-term task, and that we have to deal with today.
And do you think that her report has a wider bearing on the interpretations of the Financial Services and Markets Act of consumer responsibility, or do you think it's quite specific to that case?
I think there's a debate that will need to be had as we go forward about the position of the FCA in cases where we're not the primary cause of the harm to consumers, but we say we could have done better. And our reading of the intention of Parliament is that in those cases we certainly should do better. We should acknowledge the mistakes we made. We should improve, but that there is a specific safety net for consumers that's being created through the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which is levied upon the industry, and that is really Parliament's expression of the, the main financial compensation arrangement that exists in this area. So I think there's a potential issue there, but as I say, I'm not in any way trying to escape our responsibility for the mistakes that we made. We made mistakes that we shouldn't have made.
Nicola, did you want to add anything to either of these questions?
There is, and I'm really pleased you've raised this topic, because there is the have regard within FISM around consumers take responsibility for their own decisions. There is then a question of what's the level of regulatory safety that we should be looking to secure for different types of consumers. And I would say, coming out of the pandemic, when I look at the numbers I see on vulnerability in our society, in our economy, you're talking in excess of additionally 1 million vulnerable consumers. My feeling is that's where our focus needs to be, and that's where we need to be devoting our efforts. Whether we need to be putting the same level of effort into sophisticated consumers, very high net worth consumers, in terms of regulatory safety, or whether you feel satisfied as Parliament that they can take their own decisions, particularly when things are manifesting high risk. I think that's a conversation we need to have. I think to some extent what we need to be, and I separate this from the specifics of this case where there's clearly been mistakes, but I do think we need to have that conversation around where you'd like us politically as parliamentarians to strike that balance, and then we can operationalise it in the best way possible.
Well, I mean, certainly your proposal to government around the online harms bill, and some of the activity that leaves consumers susceptible would be very welcome. Because, I mean, my answer to you would be, we would obviously, ideally, we would like to see consumers protected, and especially those who are vulnerable, absolutely protected. And too often, and it came up in the session with Andrew Bailey, too often, the FCA can find itself between a rock and a hard place, where you've got to protect the big investors, because you're talking about scale of activity, but then the attention can be missed on activity that affects ordinary people who in proportion to their income, they've invested a significant amount of their income in like LCF, and it has a massive effect. We'd like to see both happen. The question is, what needs to be done to achieve both outcomes? I suppose I'm throwing it back at you.
Well, look, I think I can give you another example where we are in the middle and we're getting it from both sides. So on pension freedoms, clearly there's been some concern around the speed at which those were introduced and the consequences in terms of pension scams. And we have taken action with the pensions regulator and others, including some quite decisive action around advice for defined benefit pension transfers. There are many out there who think we haven't done enough and we haven't moved quickly enough, and that's a legitimate debate to be had. There's also a very significant constituency growing, and we get mail from these who say that we've gone too far, and we are taking away the right that Parliament has given them to get access to their pension by making these barriers significant hurdles, and they can't get access to it when they want to, and they're able to take their decision. And we get balance. Maybe we're striking the balance right because we're getting it from both sides right now on that specific debate. So maybe that's the test, that tests whether we're successful or not.
Okay. So moving on to complaints and compensation. In the response to Dame Elizabeth's findings on LCF, the FCA's website notes that we recognise that this is an uncertain time for bondholders. We will determine complaints against the FCA arising from LCF as quickly as we can. In line with our complaint scheme, we will consider all complaints on an individual basis. So can you both just quickly run through to the committee the complaints process and tell us about the number of complaints that you've received so far?
Okay, so we've received a little over 1,000 complaints, and we are in active communication with people who've complained to us. We keep them regularly updated about progress. So as a result of the report, I think we've now been in a position to start moving forward the assessment of individual complaints and to categorise people according to the various factors that would affect how we would deal with their complaint. And at the end of that process, we will then issue a decision to them, which will include as one of the questions that we address, whether we should offer them a compensatory payment, an ex gratia compensatory payment, which is what our complaint scheme provides for. But the complication here is that at the same time as we're doing this, we have some people who are in dialogue with the Financial Services Compensation Scheme to see what, if anything, they get from that. At the same time, there are also consumers who are waiting to see what the distribution in the liquidation of LCF is. And then there's a fourth factor, which is the Treasury's own compensation scheme. And so what we need to do is to ensure that these processes are coordinated, and not least of all to avoid requiring consumers to give the same information again and again and again in order to get an answer, and that they also produce a coherent answer.
So is the coordination happening, and how many cases have been resolved? Recognizing the points you make about the different schemes that are going on, are available.
So we haven't issued any final decisions on LCF-related complaints. We are continuing to work on them, and we will continue to work as the Treasury develops its own scheme. We need to think very carefully how those situations fit together. Our current complaint scheme, which is in essence the one that's been in place for around about 20 years, since the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000 was initially passed, envisages that in cases where there are complaints against the regulators, then obviously we will issue apologies when we have fallen short in what we did, and in cases where we're the primary cause of the loss, we'll also make compensatory payments. Although we've always been clear that those compensatory payments would not attempt to reflect the totality of the financial loss that people have suffered, and that I think is broadly the arrangement that Parliament debated back in 2012 as well. So that's the position, but obviously each complaint needs to be determined on its own merits. People will have had a different interaction with the FCA in each case, and we're doing that, and that involves listening to all the recordings of the contacts that they had with our contact centre and so on.
So just to clarify, when you wrote to in one of your responses to the chair's letter on the complaints scheme, you noted that where payments are made, they are on an ex gratia basis and typically modest. So does that follow that the payouts will be modest in relation to LCF complaints, or higher than what's normally provided, or is it should we not be preempting what might happen?
Well, I think we aim to have a policy which is consistently applied, and it's consistently applied according to the experience of the consumer concerned, rather than necessarily, obviously, the profile of the case, because there are many people who have unsatisfactory experiences in cases that are not high profile. But the scheme that we have in place does envisage modest compensatory payments, and always has done. Where we are the primary cause of an investor's loss, we will look at making somewhat larger payments for financial loss. But I think each case does need to be determined on its own merits.
Okay, just a couple of final ones. How quickly will people hear about their claims against the FCA? And just looking to the future, should firms and potentially consumers have to cover the costs of the FCA not performing well, or should it be done in some other way?
By taxpayers, you mean?
Sorry, I didn't.
Do you mean by taxpayers? I'm sorry, because there's probably no one else, is there?
What do you think? Do you think who should pay?
Well, I mean,
just on the first, they expect to hear of claims. What's the sort of time frame, and who should be paying?
Well, we will be updating people who've complained to us about the progress of their claim. I'm afraid I can't give you a deadline for the resolution of any particular claim because of the factors that I've outlined, namely the need to assess each claim individually, 1,000 claims and to ensure appropriate coordination with the other sources of redress that they're seeking. But I would be happy to write to you with further detail about what might occur. I think in terms
we can have a kind of frame, a general overall time frame, because some of these things can go on for quite a long time.
No,
whether it's 6 months or a year, or just so that people have some idea of what's down the track.
Yeah. Just on the funding of the FCA, I mean, we are funded through fees from the industry. That's the decision that Parliament's made, and we need to work within a budget that's affordable by the industry. And as Nicola has said, broadly we think we can do that, and there may be some cases where the industry would actually welcome us to devote some more resources. I think that's a funding model that works. I would like to consider a funding model across both the FCA and the FSCS, where perhaps the risk sensitivity of the funding is a bit clearer, so that the costs for firms who choose to do higher risk activities are perhaps more visible in the fee structure than is currently the case.
That's really helpful. Nicola, did you have anything to add to any of those questions?
No, I think Charles has covered the position fairly clearly. The only point I would add is I think that a model in which the FCA is having to fund in any situation where something goes wrong.
Yep.
With hindsight, you could have spotted something sooner. You could have asked a question. You go back to the banking crisis in 2008, similar sort of situations, and we just need to make sure we've got a system which holds us to account for doing our jobs properly, but also recognises that just because a case goes into enforcement or just because a firm fails, we don't operate a zero failure regime.
Sure, no, I don't expect you to do that, but we would expect a regulator to spot a financial crisis in the future. So
absolutely, I think absolutely.
We would hope you could pick that up.
Yeah, I mean, the regulator didn't spot the financial crisis last time around, and obviously had the regulator been the...
Very hopeful that you would, if they were down the line.
Yeah, but I think the point that Nicola is making is, had the regulator been responsible for itself paying out compensation equal to the entire cost of the bailouts and consumer losses that followed 2008, that would not be a system that's sustainable. It's a statement, possibly, without being rude to you, Nicola, of the obvious, but I think it's still worth making.
Absolutely, no, that I can see that would not be practical. Thank you very much.